Well, I appreciate everybody joining us this afternoon. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Matt Lenzini. I am chairman of the Caesar Rodney Institute here in Delaware. And we're very fortunate to have John Bailey with us today from AEI. John has been working as a visiting fellow and has really been focusing on issues in education, issues in retraining workforces, dealing with disruptive forces in our economy, and how do we get people properly trained to deal with these structural changes that are occurring throughout the country. John has worked as a special assistant with the White House on domestic policy with a focus on education and labor policy. He's been a policymaker in the education space and the vice president of the Foundation for Education Excellence. So I'm very happy to have John here with us. We've asked John to speak specifically to an effort he and others have been working on. 19 individuals, including former state education chiefs, city education leaders, federal education officials, network of charter schools and principals on a blueprint for getting us back into the classroom and getting us over this, what I would call an education gap that's been created with COVID. So with that, I want to welcome John. And John, if you could open up with maybe just a few comments about the work that you're doing and any insights you could give us from the initiative that you're working on.
Wonderful. Matt, thank you so much for having me today. And thanks to everyone for hopping on yet another Zoom. I know that's exactly what you needed in your life. It's one more Zoom, but you're giving us your time and attention today. We appreciate that. I'll just give a little overview of some of the work that we've been doing at AEI since the onset of the pandemic. And when schools closed, there was this question in the spring: when will they open? And what do we need to do to open schools? And so we thought it was important to put together a group of former leaders. So we brought in people from the White House that served in the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. We brought in a former chief of staff at the Department of Ed, other Department of Education officials, charter school leaders, as you mentioned, state chiefs, superintendents. We wanted it to be bipartisan. We wanted it to be diverse, and we wanted it to be also diverse in terms of leadership levels. And we also wanted former leaders. And the reason for that is because they can draw upon a lot of their leadership experience with reopening schools after Katrina, with dealing with the H1N1 virus outbreak back in 2009 and 2010. Draw on that and help us map out what are the big issues and the big buckets of that schools and states, frankly, need to consider for reopening schools. And even though we published that in May, I'll say it still holds up this many months later. And I think we've learned some things, and I'll just touch on that. But generally speaking, the way we organized the blueprint was around a series of assumptions. And one of the assumptions was that it should not be educators saying when it's safe to open schools. That is a decision that rests with public health officials. And that's probably even more important now than it was back then. But you need to listen to your state health officials and your local health officials. And when they say it's safe, then it's incumbent on us as an education system to be ready to reopen. And I think we saw the ramifications of what happened when we weren't ready back heading into the fall. But we felt it was important to say, school leaders should be focused on reopening schools. Health officials, they should be the ones saying when it's when it's healthy and safe to be able to reopen. Second, we also are making the assumption that not everyone will be able to come back to school. And I think that's proven out too, that you have some vulnerable populations, teachers over the age of 55, teachers with pre-existing health conditions, students with pre-existing health conditions. They should stay home. We know so much more about COVID now, and the risks are much, much greater for those individuals than for younger students and for healthier teachers. And so we know there's a vulnerable population that needed to have special accommodations in order to stay at home. The other thing is that we at the time in May, everyone was sort of thinking, gosh, we just need to get to the fall and we'll be able to reopen schools in the fall. And obviously we're all the way through December, and that schools have done amazing work getting partially reopened, but a lot of schools opened remote only and have been back and forth. And was this hope that there would be a vaccine very quickly. And what the challenge is like all the way back in May, what all the health officials have been telling us is that the vaccine would not be ready for 12 to 18 months, and that we needed to prepare for this disruption, not just for that academic year and this academic year, but also the upcoming academic year. Now, it has been amazing. I can't even begin to tell you how fast this Operation Warp Speed actually worked. Like, to have a virus and have it sequenced and studied and have a vaccine that's actually working, 3 vaccines potentially working by December, breaks all speed records. An average vaccine takes 7 years. A sped up vaccine takes 12 to 18 months, and this happened in less than 8 months. The challenge, though, is that that's not going to be immediately available for all teachers until probably this spring. And the vaccine manufacturers have just begun studying its effects on kids. And so kids may not be vaccinated until the spring or into the fall. And so again, we're likely to see this disruption at least going into early 2021, but also 22. And some of the issues we teed up were just, things that are all very familiar to us now. General considerations in terms of communication and collaboration. We just have seen so many schools commit some unforced errors because they had poor communication with their parents, or not a great communication system with their governor or with the state and local health officials. And so no one sort of knew who was on first. Super important in terms of school operations, transportation, just how do we get students back and forth to schools, especially in a hybrid mode where you have half the kids going back, and that increases the amount of bus transportation sort of loops that need to get the kids back. School personnel, we just mentioned that, but we have to make sure that teachers are safe and that they feel safe to be able to come back. That means a lot of PPE equipment. It means making sure that they have sanitation stations and other things in their classrooms, but it also means for teachers who are vulnerable or just don't feel comfortable coming back, we need to honor that and give them accommodations so they can stay home and be safe. We should never ask a teacher to put their life on the line to come back into the classroom. We should only do it when when it's safe for them based on what current health research says.
Talk to me a little bit about the concerns or issues with just not being in the classroom and the efficacy versus online learning, and what types of things can we do to mitigate some of that?
That's a great question. I mean, we essentially have 2 sets of data. We have data that comes from rough estimations, and this comes from organizations like NWEA, who what they do is they provide diagnostic assessments for schools, and so they can look at what that summer learning loss was, and then using statistics be able to sort of go back and estimate, well, if that's the average loss of learning over those months, you kind of move that back all the way into the spring, then what is that cumulative learning loss that students are bringing? And they just released another report this week, actually, that sort of updated that based on data that is coming in this fall. And it saw steep declines. These are, again, rough estimates, but steep declines, particularly in math. A decent actual relative sort of achievement level with reading. But again, it varies. It varies by ethnic group. It varies by low-income students who are struggling. And the one piece of information that we don't have to be able to slice and dice some of this data is, out of those students that were struggling, how many of them were online, how many were hybrid, or how many were in person? I think there's this belief that if we have kids, and we have a lot of schools across the country right now that are open, and those kids may actually be learning better and at grade level, we may be losing a lot of other students through online and with hybrid. But that gets to the second sort of bucket of data, which is coming from some of the learning systems schools have put in place. So like Zern Math is a great example of this, that they have math activities and lessons that have been completed. And they have all that as data that they made available to this organization called Opportunity Insights, which is a group of economists. And they're able to look at both learning loss in real time, not estimates, but based on the number of students who aren't completing lessons and the number of students who aren't passing the various types of lesson quizzes and exams there. So it is a massive problem. And we think it's going to impact different districts and different types of students in different ways. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you have these projections. That's why the blueprint mentions this, and a lot of the work right now, schools need to put in place diagnostic assessments to be able to assess where students are struggling, which students are struggling, how far behind are they, and then develop strategies to help them accelerate in their learning and catch them up to their peers. And we're going to need that every single day that goes by, that students are learning at home and not in a classroom, that problem just keeps compounding. And so we're going to need to be very creative and innovative with solutions next year.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about disadvantaged groups, or maybe individuals that may be falling behind, students that may be falling behind compared to their peer groups. Talk to me a little bit about that, but I'm particularly interested in technology access, right? Because I'd have to think that not everyone has access to a laptop computer. Not everybody has access to high quality broadband. And what, if anything, can we do to mitigate that at this point?
No, it's a great question. It's because this is something we saw firsthand in the spring, was that something we used to just casually refer to as the digital divide became an educational divide. That if you were a student and you didn't have an adequate computer or fast enough broadband, you literally did not have access to school. You literally did not have access to lessons. And that's just unacceptable in this day and age. And so we have seen a lot of schools rushing to make sure those kids have devices with laptops and Chromebooks. We've seen some very creative ways of extending Wi-Fi networks and MiFi hotspots. But at the end of the day, this is going to cost a lot of money to address. And we mentioned this in the blueprint, and I'm even more convinced of it now. And you have a lot of Republican governors calling on Congress to pass some additional funding that can help address what we call the homework gap, which are the number of students who lack a device of connectivity. Now, rough estimates is that that's probably 6 million students who lack that adequate sort of devices of connectivity. We think it can be fixed and solved with about $4 billion. We were super hopeful that it was going to be part of one of the economic stimulus packages. And unfortunately, that has just dragged on those negotiations. Where I'm hopeful is that a bipartisan group of senators this week released a package and it had $10 billion in for broadband. And so we're hopeful that Congress could come together as part of this next economic package, make sure that there's some dollars out there to connect not just these kids, but also these families. Like it is low-income families who have always relied on different types of government services, but by going to government offices, you can't do that today. Government offices are shut down. When I needed to get my driver's license renewed, they said, we'll see you in 2 months at this appointment at this time. And it's just like, that's just too difficult. And so the only way a lot of people are going to be able to file for unemployment, for food stamps, and for other social benefit services is through online. And we need to make sure those families have the devices of connectivity to access that.
This is a little bit of a left field question. I mean, is there any opportunity for schools or districts to maybe utilize some of the CARES Act funds in the short term to bridge that gap, or is that way too out of left field?
No, that's not out of left field at all. In fact, I think we're seeing, I think at the last count, you've seen close to 15 states use some of their state set aside dollars to help make sure students had devices of connectivity. That was particularly true in Arkansas, also in Mississippi, and a handful of other states. And then also districts were receiving dollars and could use those dollars. It had enormous flexibility with it. And I think when a lot of districts realized, you know what, we're not going to be able to open up, what they did is they started reprioritizing those CARES Act dollars to buy for devices and connectivity for kids, training and online materials for their teachers, and tried to stitch together another online learning plan.
Okay, good. That's great. And I'm not sure if we're doing that locally here or not, but that might be something we want to poke our heads into here in Delaware. Kind of in the order of challenging or subgroups, I'd have to think that there are different subject matters that may not translate well to online learning. There may be age groups that may not pick up online learning as efficiently. Any thoughts on that, or any insights from your research on those areas?
Yeah, I think we're learning as teachers and families are learning about all this. It's been clear that actually math has actually worked pretty well in terms of online formats. Reading has been a bit more of a challenge, and that makes sense in some ways, because especially with younger kids, it's not just about sort of having access to Zoom. You need books. Kids need books in order to be able to kind of explore reading at their own pace and get exposed to words and practice reading out loud. And And so that has been a little bit of a challenge. Also, younger grades and younger students, it's just a lot. I mean, I don't know about all of you, but I am exhausted at the end of the day with all the Zoom meetings. I love webinars like this. I love talking to Matt. I love Zooms with my colleagues over at AI, but it's draining and it takes a lot of concentration. I just cannot imagine myself at the age of 8 or 9 being able to have the discipline to be able to sit there and pay attention for that long. And so I think we're learning that maybe it's better to have younger students come back to school and actually use the online learning for upper grades. We're also seeing some experimentation. Israel was the first to do this, to say, let's bring our special needs children back to school. We'll keep everyone else at home in an online learning environment. The special needs students have unique needs, and let's bring them in where we can keep them distant, but give them more of the one-on-one attention that they need and deserve. And I think we're just now beginning to see some experimentation with that kind of model here in the United States too, to say some students that are really struggling the most, let's bring them back into school, and we can keep all the other students at home in sort of an online or a hybrid situation there. But we're learning as we go, and it's definitely been a challenge. But it's also one of these things where if you think about it, so few people were doing online learning just 8 months ago. Now everyone's sort of experimenting with it. And so we're getting a sense of what works well on Zoom, what works well in terms of an online program like Azure that you can sort of give out to students and have students complete at their own pace. And then what are other ways to use technology tools to kind of keep kids engaged and active?
I want to go back a little bit to the topic of reading and just general literacy there, because there are some measures that show if you fall behind early as a child and in reading, you will continue to struggle throughout your education going forward. And I don't remember the specific measure, but there was some point in time where it said if you haven't picked up the skill by X year, you'll basically always be behind and never catch up. And I mean that scares me a lot right now, because what I hear is that we have a subject matter that doesn't translate well over remote learning, and it's critical to future success. And I don't know how much thought or time you guys have put into this, but how do we start? How do we address that? I mean, do you get those children into the classroom? Do you just make sure that maybe you segment it where reading and the language arts are done in the classroom, and the math and hard subjects, STEM type subjects, are done remotely? I'm just curious if you've seen any experimentation in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting on a point that is so critically important, which is it's usually if students aren't proficient in reading by the end of the 3rd grade, we just know that learning in school becomes much more difficult after that. And that just makes sense, that if you because reading is just one of these gateway skills, that if you can't read, it's really hard to do 9th grade history, 9th grade science, 9th grade math, any of these other subjects, because the way we teach requires a lot of reading. So making sure kids have the fundamental reading skills by the end of the 3rd grade is just super, super important for their success in later grades and in other subjects. And it's become a big challenge. And I think it's going to be one of these things when we talk about learning loss, it will be about how to identify where students are, where are they struggling? Is it that they actually know their words and their vocabulary? It's just reading out loud. And they're all going to need a lot more individualized attention and instruction in order to help them accelerate and catch up. That could be done through tutoring. It could be done actually with technology platforms. There are a number of other great personalized learning platforms that can take a student and help them catch up in reading using books and also using some online tools. So I think what you're going to have is districts trying to identify those students with some assessments, and then making sure they get just the type of tailored help and assistance that they need. And that's going to be through tutoring. It's going to be probably through some extended learning time, whether that's a summer school or after hours programs. And it's probably going to be using some combination of technology going forward too, to make sure that they're learning and accelerating in their lessons.
You mentioned tutoring and kind of that tailored instruction. Do we have the resources to handle that at a volume? I would just think I would just think that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, look, I completely agree. And the one thing that worries me is that we as a country right now we're in this like fog of COVID where it is so hard to see 6 weeks ahead of us, right? Like, 6 weeks ago, we were all hoping for Thanksgiving holiday where we'd be able to see our family and our friends and then all of a sudden that just was off the table because of health risks. And so it's so hard to see what's coming up with this next holiday season, much less what's coming up several months from now. But as we're living in this third peak of COVID, the thing that worries me is right behind all these peaks is this wave of student learning loss. And it is a wave that's going to crash over the entire country. And to your point, we don't have great systems and lessons, frankly, to draw upon from the past. It's something that needs to be scaled across the whole country. We've seen tutoring work in certain places, but again, more in a targeted kind of way that was done with school districts. It's going to require a lot of creative thinking. We need the Operation Warp Speed for learning loss. We need to bring the best of research with the best of government resources, with the best of the private sector, and say, how are we going to make sure we catch all students up over this next year, including on reading and some of the math skills where students are falling behind. So I think we can do it, but we need to start marshaling those resources now, some of that creative thinking now, so that we're not like trying to catch up to this in June and try to figure out what to do with the summer. Like, we know this is going to be there. It's just a matter of how big this wave is going to be. So why not use this time now to help plan and make sure we have systems in place?
Absolutely, absolutely. To that effect, in the hands-on, the person-to-person, or tutor to student, or however the relationship works. What other creative solutions are you seeing? I know we talked a little bit about these small communities of parents and teachers that have kind of cropped up on their own to address some of that in-person learning gap. Talk to me a little bit about that, what you're seeing, how those are being structured. Are they being formalized, or is this just all ad hoc?
Yeah. No, I mean, look, every crisis creates a catalyst for innovation, and it's usually a catalyst out of necessity. And what happened in July is that as parents were facing the prospects of weeks, if not months, of their students continuing to learn online, parents began to self-organize, and they began organizing and these things that we don't even have like a great terminology for. We call them learning pods or parent pods or pandemic pods, but essentially they're parents coming together and saying, let's organize some activities for our kids. Let's maybe hire a tutor or bring in a teacher to help, give them some structure, some extra assistance to help them complete their work. And this is being done in all kinds of different ways. This is the innovation part of it. Some school districts are actually using pods as part of their remote learning program. Detroit is. We're seeing this in Atlanta, Georgia. We're also seeing it at Adams 12 in Colorado. But you're seeing some parents happening here in Virginia and also across the country that are like, our schools aren't helping us, so we have to help ourselves. And they're doing this. They're doing it with themselves. They're doing it with community groups, with churches. Some businesses are opening up some of their unused facilities to give places for parents to go. But it's been an amazing sort of self-organized effort that has evolved since July. Like, there's a lot of questions about how durable is that? Like, how much does this last post COVID? But I don't know. I think once parents kind of get a taste of this, they're going to want this as part of their education portfolio for their students, for their children, I should say, going forward. So I suspect we're going to see a lot of districts as part of learning loss and as part of their general programming, trying to support pods in some form or fashion.
A little bit of just a thought. We talked a lot about the need for community and education, and if I would put a silver lining around anything that's happening with COVID and education, it sounds like this is driving community back into education and forcing parents to be more engaged, more involved, and kind of bringing that locus of control a little bit closer to to the, the family structure. And again, just thinking out loud, I mean, I don't know if there's a way to maintain that going forward, because what we've seen, or what I've seen in the past, is there is a correlation between parental involvement in a child's education and the success of that child in their educational career. So I would love to see this idea transcend COVID and carry on through the future. So I don't know if we can systematize it or find some way to make it more methodical.
No, Matt, I totally agree with you. This is a genie you can't put back in the bottle. Like, as a result of schools closing and the way in which they've been closed, it has forced parents into situations in a whole bunch of different ways. Like, for the first time, parents are in the classroom with kids. They're looking over their shoulder. They're seeing what's being taught via Zoom or what the lessons are. They're much more active and hands-on in just terms of understanding what has been going on. That is something that, again, is going to be a much, much more informed set of parents going forward, even when schools reopen. But second, I think it's created this sort of, it's created a swirl of emotions, as we're all sort of experiencing. There's silver linings and there's frustrations. And what I'm hearing from parents who are seeing this in surveys is that they are frustrated. They're very, very frustrated that we're this many months into COVID and some of the fundamental things are still so broken and not working. And on the other hand, they're also fundamentally so appreciative of teachers. And so I think you're going to find this notion of being super, super appreciative of teachers going forward. But also, you're going to have a much, much more activist sort of set of parents that are going to be active in decisions and expressing that at school board meetings and all sorts of other ways. Even when school kind of reopens and goes back, we're also going to have a whole nother group of parents that are just so frustrated that they've opted out. They've taken their kids, they've enrolled them in a private school, a charter school that has been open, or they've put them in a pod and now they're going to homeschool. And I think some of those parents will come back, but a lot of those parents are going to stay there. They're going to say, you know what, I actually kind of enjoyed being able to have this type of relationship with my kid over this period of time. Or they're going to say, I never would have considered a Catholic school before, but now all of a sudden I really like the Catholic school education that my child is getting. And they did it out of necessity, just because that was the school that was open when their public school was closed. And so it is creating a ton of tension and swirling emotions as we're all going through, that I think it's really important for us to understand. And we've been doing some survey research with some of the foundation partners that I work with, and pulsing parents and just kind of continuing to get a sense of where they are and where their heads are and their hearts are as they go forward during this crisis is going to be really important.
It does bring up an interesting question, not just about the pods and learning going forward, but what role should the parent or guardian play in the decision making of whether or not their child goes back to the classroom or not? I know different states have taken kind of different approaches on this, and I don't know if you've seen parents wanting to have that decision making authority, and can they exercise it? I'm curious your thoughts on that front.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the one thing that we've been seeing, and it's coming out in surveys, it's being expressed, frankly, in this whole pod movement, are parents weren't consulted. They didn't necessarily have the option of deciding. Some school districts did. I'll say, like, the schools that seem to be doing the best in terms of maintaining community and parent trust were the ones that said, okay, let's do a survey. How many of you want to send your kids back? How many want to do a hybrid, and how many want to do online, hybrid, or in person? And they're trying to accommodate that in various forms or fashions. But what you also have is, like, the New York City example last week is a great one. Like, there was this arbitrary number, if the community spread is 3%, schools would close. And all of a sudden they kept teasing that maybe we're going to close, maybe we're going to open. And then the mayor announced it, and the mayor announced it through a tweet. They didn't even sort of like give parents enough of a heads up. And I think parents were just very, very frustrated about that. And only to have that reversed 4 or 5 days later. And that is a nuisance, to people in jobs like you and me that can Zoom in. But for a lot of working class parents that have schedules and shifts that need to be mapped and planned out a couple days in advance, that just wreaks havoc on them. And and so again, I think in many ways it is creating a much more activist group of parents and who are demanding choice from their school that their kids are going to. And if they can't get it there, they're looking for options elsewhere. And that's everything from pods to other school options too.
Kind of on the other side of the coin, where or what train of thought do the teachers and principals have at this point? I mean, are they giving any feedback into what they want to see or how they want to see this work, or what steps could be taken to make it better?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, in school districts that have done this well, there have been active and ongoing conversations with their teachers as you need that. This is not the type of thing where you can lock a group of people into a room and have them come out with a remote learning plan. It needs to be teacher-led and teacher-involved. I think what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing in surveys are two things. Teachers are exhausted, that this is a lot that has been thrown at them, and they're trying to relearn their entire profession through new mediums, new tools, and also that tools that sometimes don't work. Like Matt, you and I were, as we were waiting in the green room, like we were trying to get your mic to work, and it was like, just imagine if that was a teacher who has to have a live class with 20 kids, at the top of the hour, and like, who do you call, or what happens if one of your kids can't log in? It's like super frustrating, and they're learning a new medium, a new mode of teaching, and so there's frustration there. On the other hand, I think what you've seen is, especially from the teachers unions, is a lot of fear-based sort of mindset on a lot of this of again, asking not just beyond sort of CDC recommended protections and protocols for their teachers and for their schools, but going way and above that. I'm seeing some teachers unions saying they want to see community positivity rates below 1% before we open the schools, and no one's recommending that. Not the WHO, not the CDC, not many state health officials. Even this 3% number that they came up with in New York wasn't based on any science. It was just sort of an arbitrary number that the mayor and the unions negotiated with. And the sad thing about that is that I don't think that serves the teachers well, and it's definitely not serving kids well. And so you have the exhausted teachers, you have teachers that are being told that all these different things are unsafe when that may not necessarily be the case. And we're sort of missing the different important issues and protocols and measures to put in place to make sure this is a safe time for teachers as well as for the kids, and that we can get them in the classroom as soon as possible.
Yeah, so obviously a lot of challenges in the near term, and we even talked a little bit about addressing the gap in a future state and the potential resource challenges we have on that front. And I don't know if you've worked on this or thought about this at all, but one of the elements that always comes into my mind is, the economic challenges as well, right? So you have parents who may not be able to go to work right now because they have to stay home and make sure their children are paying attention on a Zoom call or in the classroom. But then you also add into that the long-term effects of, if our education system and the students coming out on the other end are a year and a half behind. I mean, there's massive deleterious effects and long-term economic prosperity. And again, I don't know that you've looked at this or anyone spent time at that, but I've got to think that the time and effort to try to address this now, it will be much less expensive than the long-term economic impacts if we don't get it right.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. It's one of the things we're seeing, because again, the economy has never had a shock like what we're experiencing right now. It is so fundamentally different from every recession that we've experienced in the past. And the recovery coming out of this is also very different. And it's funny, about a month ago, I took one of my first airplane flights, and the airport was just dead. It was almost as if you could see the economy is measured by sort of airline connective tissues. Like it was like on its like medically induced coma. Like things were just slow, and this is in the recovery. For a while, economists like they get in their own debates too, and they were debating: is this going to be a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped or a W-shaped? And the shape that is emerging is a K-shaped, which is there's a whole class of white-collared and service-oriented professionals that have actually not seen a disruption of work. We've just disrupted because I don't go on flights every week, but I'm Zooming, I'm still earning a paycheck, and my income has been steady. And you've seen those service jobs actually recovering very fast. And then there's the K-shape, the lower part of the K, with a lot of middle class and low income jobs and shift jobs that have been struggling. And this is particularly tied to hotels and travel, but a whole bunch of other industries. And the challenge is that, we have not had the response that we had back in May when Congress passed the CARES Act. It was about providing that financial support to make it possible for small businesses to close for a period of weeks, to make it possible for families to shelter in place for a period of weeks with some direct cash benefit. And we haven't sort of passed another package. And so as a result, you have families that are struggling to make ends meet, needing to pay bills, but also simultaneously being told by politicians and others that they need to stay in place and that they can't go anywhere. And increasingly, I think there's this element of hypocrisy that's been coming into it. Like we saw this with Governor Newsom in California, where at a time when everyone was being told to stay home, he went to one of the nicest restaurants in America and
French Laundry.
had this party. French Laundry, which is great, but again, sort of sent this mixed message to people. And the mayor of Austin literally just got caught yesterday recording a video telling people to stay home, but he was doing it in Cabo, Mexico, where he had just flown. And so I think a lot of people are frustrated. They're frustrated because it feels like it's a mandate for everyone else except for a high group of elites, and it's becoming frustrating.
So I'll ask you to put on your other hat for a second. One of the things that's happening outside of just the education space is this shift to technology, and some folks will say we've had a 10-year technology adoption cycle compressed into 6 months in some respects, and there are going to be structural changes in a lot of the ways that people work. Looking at the other end of that, right? I mean, those jobs and those folks that may not end up back in work on the other side of COVID, we also need to be thinking about what education needs do they have, right? And where's the gap, and how do we get those folks back into gainful employment? What skills will they need in the future versus what they did just 12 months ago? So, and again, I don't know how much time or thought's been put into that as well, but there are just so many compounding issues here that need to be addressed.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, like recessions tend to be a period where, ironically, companies accelerate their automation. And that has been particularly true during this economic time period. That you see this in surveys done by McKinsey and a lot of other business groups, that out of necessity, so many of these companies have had to, much in the same way that schools overnight had to switch to remote learning, these CEOs and these companies had to switch to a whole bunch of different online and digital delivery in a way that they hadn't been thinking about or had planned. But to your point, instead of doing it over 10 years, they're doing it in a span of months. And so you're seeing Best Buy, even Walmart, closing some stores and turning them into e-commerce centers that can help do fulfillment. Part of the reason that Salesforce bought Slack in this mega merger this week in acquisition was because they're making a bet that work is not going to look the same going forward. We're not going to go back entirely, and that remote work will be here to stay. And we're already seeing that with some of the tech companies out in Silicon Valley, where they're saying, you know what, we're going to let you work anywhere, work remotely. And so people are saying, you know what, that means I can leave the high rental and high property cost California with all the traffic, with the fires, and they can have a better quality of life and still work at Google and still work at Facebook and still work at Microsoft. And so I think there's going to be a much more sort of flexible work arrangement. But to your point, what I worry the most about is that with all these automation, that means we're displacing some of the lower skilled jobs, but it means also every new job that's created is a bit more higher skill because it requires someone who can work the technology or do more customer service that requires more emotional, social emotional learning type of skills in terms of interacting with someone. And all of that means that we have to have a pretty robust and fast-paced job training system at the end of this.
And should we also be thinking about how to incorporate that into, you know, some of our education, you know, maybe at the high school level, right? As we transition into this new world, do we need to be preparing them differently because things are very different and are going to look very different than they were 12 months ago? And has there been thought put into that as well?
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, again, on the other side of COVID, we could be asking in much the same way that companies are asking, should work look different? We should be asking, what about remote learning and hybrid learning worked and we should keep, and what didn't work? And we should either just do away with or figure out a better way to do it. And I sort of think that, you know, on the other side of this, when you have an environment where more students have devices and better connectivity, and everyone has had more experience with online systems and tools, they'll keep a lot of aspects of this. I doubt we're ever going to have another snow day because so many districts will be able to just literally turn on their remote learning plan and kids will be able to do self-directed work or do Zooms at home. I'm not sure that would have been possible without COVID. And so it's going to prompt, I think, a lot of rethinking. I don't think it's going to get rid of buildings entirely, but I do think we're going to be able to come out of this with blending the best of online with the best of in-person, and hopefully have a much better education experience that's working for all these students that it wasn't working for before.
So we're running up to 4 o'clock here, and I wasn't sure if you had any other comments you wanted to make sure, or topics you wanted to make sure we covered. If not, I wanted to offer out to folks, if they have questions, you can type them into the chat box here, and we'll get them up and out to John and see if we can address them. John, in the interim, while folks are thinking, you know, we talked a lot about the different models. Are there any states or cities that are doing it particularly well that we should be looking at and saying, all right, here's an area where they're getting it mostly right, and we can start porting that elsewhere? I mean, any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. I don't know if anyone is getting this completely right. Miami-Dade, you know, had some early advantages, and part of the reason they did is because Miami-Dade is in Hurricane Central. They've always had to plan for disruption of class in school, where schools might be shut down for as long as 2 weeks. It was very similar to kind of the challenges we faced in COVID. So they had a bit of a head start. So I think you can look there. I've heard great things about Guilford County, Success Academy, which is a group of charter schools up in New York. They had this very interesting approach that I think makes a lot of sense, where they didn't say to all their teachers, you all have to be Zoom experts and be the best performers on Zoom. What they did is they picked the best lecturer, the best teacher on each subject in each grade, and had them record the lesson. And then it not only freed up time, but it freed up all that pressure from other teachers that just got, scared or frustrated with just dealing with kind of recording their own videos. It freed them up. It's a brilliant idea. We should be taking that and porting it. But we're going to be on the other side of this, looking at a lot of lessons learned. I've been looking at a lot of research coming out of the Center for Reinventing Public Education, CRI. They've been highlighting some good best practices. A group of all the education technology directors that served from Clinton all the way through Obama just did a document outlining the 10 action steps for how to make online learning work better. And that was done for the COVID Collaborative. So you just Google COVID Collaborative and you can find the document there, but that gives some other roadmaps for how to do this well and some other examples of success too.
Okay. Bill, do we have any questions from anybody?
It looks like Kara has her hand up, so I'm going to, oh.
Or she put her hand down.
She put her hand down? That's okay. Everyone's pretty quiet. I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay.
All right.
So it's more a comment. All right. So we have a little one at the house, and it's been a challenge. I know when the online classes are on, and we'll take a look, and the teacher has sent them into a breakout room, right? And they'll do what they need to do, and then all of a sudden they get on their phones. So it's a challenge, I guess, for us to be there all the time when we're also working, to make sure they're doing what they're doing, I guess. And my thought is, and my comment has to do with what's going to happen when they come and take the standardized test every single year. How is that going to look when you can compare it and you're like, wow, they're just going to lose a whole year worth of learning that they, you know, I just foresee it just being like just horrible. You know, like, is the standardized test not going to matter? Do you know this year?
So it's a great question. This is a policy issue, and there's two nested policy questions in your question. One is, should we administer state assessments this year? And then the second is, how should we use them? Because administering the assessments then feed usually state accountability systems that have with it all sorts of other actions and implications. And I think there's broad consensus amongst Democrats and Republicans, state and federal leaders, that we probably need a 1-year moratorium on accountability in a sense of not necessarily using the assessments to trigger a number of different type of corrective actions. On the other hand, I think there is growing concern that we won't have states administer the assessments, and then we're going to miss out on just this critical piece of information, which is how are students doing? How are they doing in different areas, different types of students? And then to your point too, like, how are students doing that we're learning online or learning in hybrid or learning in person? And using that information, not in to penalize schools, but instead to kind of help inform and shape some of the interventions and the structures that we need. And I think that's going to be really difficult. We have to think now about what assessments look like in the spring in order to be able to commit to do it. We should be able to do it. We've already seen College Board and the AP were able to do online AP exams. In the spring, we've seen other states experimenting with different types of moving their assessments online. So it's not going to be perfect, but some information is better than no information. Otherwise, we're just going to go into the next year with a black hole of data that could tell us a lot in terms of helping to direct resources and interventions to help the kids that need it the most. It's a great question.
You mentioned the moratorium on accountability for the test. I would assume within that you would also encompass any funding that normally goes along with testing or test results and things of that nature. I mean, so if I'm not mistaken, some states, some school districts, part of their formulas for funding looks at, you know, where a school is as far as its performance and makes adjustments. I would think we have to make some modifications to those types of systems and make sure that people, you know, groups are not penalized or you know, areas where we don't have access to technology aren't put further into a bad place because their funding got further trimmed because they're not meeting expectations.
Yeah, I suspect what we're going to see as a state policy question, and I think what's going to happen is you're going to essentially do, like, they're going to freeze. They're going to take a lot of what happened in 2019, 2020 and use that as the formula for going into 2021, 22. I suspect that's typically what's been done in the past when you've had these kind of disruptions. It will vary. The one other sort of dynamic on this is that we're seeing across the country enrollments dropping. And it seems small, like it seems like 3% for school, but it's 6 and 10% in some cases. And that's a much, much bigger deal for schools with financing, because so much of the way we fund schools is based on per pupil, or per average daily attendance. And so fewer students enrolling in school means that districts may get actually less money next year, unless there's like a hold harmless. You might see some state legislatures say, you know what, like, we understand this has been completely disruptive. We'll do a hold harmless this year, and then we'll re-up the counts the next year. But that is going to be one of the big thorny, tricky problems that we're going to have to struggle with the next couple of months here.
Well, Bill, I don't see any other questions. Okay,
there's
sorry.
one more. Miguel had a question. Miguel, I'm going to allow you to talk so you can ask your question. Don't worry, you won't be on camera, or maybe you will. Miguel, unmute yourself. Miguel is from down south. We have northern Delaware, southern Delaware. Southern Delaware is where all like the beach and everything. Miguel is from down south.
Nice. I need to go where Miguel is then.
Let's see. While Miguel is trying to unmute himself, I'm going to read a question here from Pamela Orris. With so many students losing 1 year of learning, has there been any discussions about students repeating their current grade level?
That's a great question. I mean, I have a policy colleague in Washington, D.C. who works at the Fordham Institute, Mike Petrelli, and he suggested that at one point. And that's pretty controversial. Like, I don't think we're going to see any ones that are doing a massive holding all students back a grade. In some ways, that makes matters even more challenging, because what happens then is you're holding everyone back, and then there's a pipeline of other students coming in, and so it creates a huge bunched up point. But I don't know. I don't think you're going to see that in a massive at a sort of a state level. Might see it happen at a district level, but there's a lot of consequences to that would be really, really difficult. So I don't think we're going to see it used in sort of a wide scale type of approach.
Okay, so we have another question from John Tedman. John, I'm going to allow you to talk, so unmute yourself when you come on.
John, are you calling from the beach too?
He is, actually.
Actually, I'm about 2 miles from the beach.
Oh my gosh, you're so much better than I am right now.
Well, look, we all make choices, right? The question is this, John. The sort of a national discussion has sort of bubbled up about direct funding of the student.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we are actually in our institute are looking at a project, a demonstration project, a thought we have right now about doing a demonstration project in some of the very poorly performing 30 years in a row, middle schools and so forth. And so I was wondering, with the research you guys are doing, how do you see the future of direct funding of students?
Yeah, so by direct funding, do you mean directly funding the child to be able to go to the school of their choice or put together the portfolio of learning of their choice?
Yeah, like their mother or their father gets a debit card that can only be spent on education. They can do the pod. They can do any of the choices they want.
Yeah. I mean, there are these things called education savings accounts that are popping up around the country, and that is that debit card like approach that you were mentioning. It's being used in Arizona, Nevada, Florida, a handful of places. In the past, it's been targeted for special needs parents and kids, in part because they need unique tutoring and specialized therapies and other things that maybe a district isn't offering. I think what you're seeing because of COVID is that a lot of people want this to be more mainstream. And we're already seeing some governors using CARES Act dollars as a way of maybe providing some direct financial assistance to parents. You have obviously seen Secretary DeVos say that some part of the economic package should include financial resources for these parents to let them help them offset the supplies that they have to buy, or the digital divide as we were talking about, or to enroll in another school. It doesn't look likely that there's a federal path for that. I'm much, much more bullish on a lot of the state policy, and there are good groups out there helping to provide advice and guidance on that. Governor Jeb Bush's Foundation for Excellence in Education, It's been really on the forefront of some of the education savings accounts. I think you could also go to EdChoice, which has also been thinking and working on this, but there are some good groups working with governors. And I think if anything is coming out of COVID, it's accelerating that kind of work. And I'm much more bullish on school choice coming out of this than even before, even though it was making very steady progress before. I think this is going to supercharge it.
Thank you.
Well, John Bailey, appreciate your time. I know we've got a stop here at 4. It was very interesting and insightful, and hopefully by summer we can all enjoy the beach, not just a few of us. So take care, and really, really appreciate your time today.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Appreciate all of you. Thanks so much.
Take care, sir.